Good morning. We're learning Tractate Eruvin, Perek Rishon, the first chapter. The name of the chapter is Movishu Gavoya. We end off yesterday with the Gemara brought an example with a caravan encamped in an open field, and they surrounded it, their encampment, with a barricade made with camels, with saddles. So this whole sugya is about, this whole discussion is about poet's go'imed, which means, do I treat the area that is open as if it's closed? So, for example, if we surrounded an area, we created an enclosure by obviously higher than up to 10 tefachim high. Gemara brought examples of saddles. Now we're speaking about camels, using the camels, but they not dealing with the entrance. The entrance itself can be up to 10 amis, but the enclosure, if the gap between one saddle, we'll call it a fence or wall, from the other, creating a gap, if it's too large, it's poets, there's an opening. So if that area is considered closed or not. So obviously it depends on the space, but we have machlokes between Rav Papa, right? We have machlokes between Rav Papa and Rav Huna. Rav Papa said poets go'imed. Papa said that it's mutar, it's permitted. The gaps in the partition equal to, primarily the discussion is if it's equal to the partition, that becomes the question. If it's more, if it's less, they all agree that it's okay. If it's more, they all agree that it's a problem. But if it's even, that's the question. Meaning that if the gap, I'm creating now an enclosure, right? It has an opening, we're creating a ches, right? It's an enclosure. And but the wall that I made has some gaps in between. So if the gaps are as much as for example, the size of the saddle, let's say, is 2 tefachim. So the gap is also 2 tefachim. It's exactly 2 tefachim. That's where the question is. According to Rav Papa, it's mutar. It's still allowed. You're allowed to carry inside this enclosure. And according to Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yeshua, it is forbidden. And then the Gemara goes on bringing different cases. So the last case we discussed is Shayol Shechonsu Viko, if a caravan encamped in an open field, Vikifu Begmalin Bukofis, and they surrounded it, their encampment with barricade, made with camels, with saddles, Avitin Shalom, Avitin Vishlifin, cushions with bundles, Bekonim, Vikilochos with reeds, vegetable stalks, metaltalim v'seicho, they may carry within this enclosure. Provided there is not between one camel and the next a gap, the width of a camel. And between one saddle and the next, the width of a saddle. Nor between one cushion and the next, the width of a cushion. So the Brisa implies that carrying is prohibited in an area enclosed by partition whose gaps are equal to their solid sections. So, like I said, this is where the issue is when it comes to partition, that the gaps are equal to their solid sections. Now, so we see from here, this is supports of Huna, the son of Yeshua. The Gemara says, Achanami, here too, it is possible the Baita refers to a case where the gap between one object and the next is so wide that a similar object goes in and out of it easily. Consequently, the gaps are in fact slightly larger than the solid parts of the partition, and that's why it should be prohibited. The Gemara presents another proof. Tashma nimtzeis ataymer sholosh midos b'mechitzas. Consequently, you must say that there are three categories of partitions. Kol shu pachot mishloisho, whenever the solid sections of the partition are less than 3 tefachim wide, it is necessary that there should be, not between one section and the next, a gap as wide as 3 tefachim. So that a kid, baby goat, cannot leap headlong through the partition unimpeded, as long as the gaps are less than 3 tefachim, wide. The partition is valid even if the gaps are wider than the solid sections of the partition. That's one category. We have with the kid, it's not more than 3 tefachim, shouldn't be able to pass through. The second category is kol shu, not really to pass through, it's to stick his head in. As long as the gaps are less than 3 tefachim, now, kol shu gimel umi gimel ad daled, whenever the solid sections of the partitions are exactly 3, or between 3 and 4 tefachim wide, we're holding in 16a1 in the right column. Tzorich shelo yehe ben ze lo ze kimlo'oi. It is necessary that there should not be between one section and the next a gap as wide as the section itself, so that the open area of the partition does not equal the walled partition. And if the open area of the partition is larger than the walled portion, also it is forbidden to plant grain or greens even opposite the wall segments. In this case, it's discussing the laws of kilaim, of how far you have to separate from one area to the next. Kol shu daled u'ma'arba ad ames. Whenever the solid sections of the partition are exactly 4 tefachim, or between 4 and 10 ames wide, it is necessary there should not be between one section and the next a gap as wide as this section itself, so that the open area of the partition does not equal the walled partition. Poutz ka'omed. The open area is poutz. Ka'omed should not equal the walled partition. Ve'imaya poutz ka'omed. And if the open area of the partition does equal the walled partition, keneged ha'omed mutar keneged ha'poutz also. It is permitted to plant grain or greens opposite the wall segment. Keneged ha'poutz also, but it is forbidden to plant grain or greens opposite the gaps. So the Baita concludes with 3 general rules that apply in all categories of partition. All categories of partitions. And if the walled portion is larger than the open area, it is permitted to plant grain and greens even opposite the gaps. That's if there is more walled portion than gaps. So also if there is a gap in the partition of more than 10 ames, planting is prohibited. If there were trapped poles embedded in the ground on either side of the gap. Almost like thorns and things that would disturb you from, or would make it difficult to pass through the gaps. There was trapped poles embedded in the ground on either side of the gap, and one construct a crossbar of plated vine above them, extending from one pole to the other. Even if the gap between the post is more than 10 amas wide, it is permitted to plant grain and greens opposite it. The Gemara now shows that the Baisa is apparently incompatible with the opinion of Rav Papa. So we're going into 16.8.2. So in the Baisa teaches at any rate in the beginning clause, if the solid sections of the partitions are between 3 and 4 tefachim wide, the partition is valid, provided that there is not between one section and the next a gap as wide as the section itself. We see that a partition is invalid if its gaps and solid sections are equal. To the Rav Papa, this is a refutation of the opinion of Rav Papa. What does the Baisa mean to the term as wide as the section itself? It means that the gap is wide enough for an item as wide as one of the solid sections to go in and out easily. So the gaps are actually slightly wider than the solid sections themselves. Only in such a case is the partition invalid, not when they are equal. This even seems more reasonable. Rav Papa's explanation of this Baisa, in fact, seems preferable. If the open area is larger than the walled portion, also it is forbidden to plant grain and greens, even opposite the wall segments. This implies muta. But would the open area be equal to the walled portion? Planting would be permitted. Shmamina learned from this that a portion which is half open and half solid is valid as Rav Papa rules. Having shown that the Baisa seems to confirm the opinion of Rav Papa, the Gemara now considers whether it can be reconciled with the opinion of Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yeshua. Shall we say that this Baisa is a refutation of the opinion of Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yeshua? Perhaps not. Amar Loch, Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yeshua, would say to you, according to your reasoning, that this Baisa permits a partition which is half open and half solid. Ema Sefer, recite and explain the end clause of the Baisa, which states, if the walled portion of the partition is larger than the open area, it is permitted to plant vines and grains even opposite the gaps. This implies also, but if the walled portion is equal to the open area, planting is prohibited. This part of the Baisa supports the position of Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yeshua. What did he say in the beginning, right after the Mishnah? That a partition which is half open and half solid is invalid. When there is an even space between the gap and the solid area, it's invalid. Sefer kasher Rav Papa, reisha kasher Rav Huna, brei Rav Yeshua. So the end clause is a contradiction to the opinion of Papa, and the beginning clause is contradiction to the opinion of Rav Huna, the son of Yeshua. The Gemara reconciles the entire Baisa with either opinion. The Gemara says, Sefer Rav Papa leikashia. The end clause is not a contradiction to Rav Papa. Either the Tana Reisha post Meruba Le'emed, since the beginning clause uses the expression the open area is larger than the walled portion to describe an invalid partition. That's not the case that Rav Huna is discussing. Rav Huna is discussing a case where it's exactly the same. The gap and the solid is the same space. Tana Seifa and Aymed Meruba Lapo, the end clause uses the converse expression. The walled portion is larger than the open area to describe a valid partition. So if you look at the difference between Reisha and Seifa, the beginning and the end, beginning clause and the end clause, the beginning clause is speaking about the pods, the open area, the gap. The Seifa is first discussing the closed area, the solid area, and then speaking about the open area. But the Gemara now reconciles the bias with the opinion of Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yeshua. Why the beginning clause is not difficult to Rav Huna Bar Yeshua? I did the void mit and sefer. Since the Baisa wants to use the expression in the end clause, that the solid is the walled portion is larger than the open area to describe a valid partition. Tana Reish uses the converse expression in the beginning clause, the open area is larger than the walled portion to describe an invalid partition. The Gemara notes that the first category in the Brisa includes wall sections that are less than 3 tefachim wide, but the section of exactly 3 tefachim are included in the second category. The system of classification is apparently incompatible with the opinion of Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua. As the Gemara explains, Bishma Rav Papa, it is understandable according to Rav Papa, who validates a partition of equal section and gaps. The reason that the Brisa did not combine them, the section of less than 3 with section of exactly 3, and state them together in the first category, according to Rav Papa, a partition whose sections are exactly 3 tefachim wide is valid even if the gaps between the section are also 3 tefachim. Therefore, it could not be placed in the first category, which contains those partitions that are disqualified by gaps of 3 tefachim. But according to Rav Huna, the son of Yeshua, who invalidates a partition of equal sections, let the Baisa combine them, combine the section of less than 3 tefachim with section of exactly 3 in 16a3, and state them together in the first category, since in both of these cases gaps of 3 tefachim invalidates the partition. The first clause in the Baisa should have read, whenever the solid section of the partition, you're building a partition, and the solid section, the walls that you're building, are less than 3, it is necessary that there should not be between one section and the next a gap as wide as 3 tefachim. Mishum because the disqualification described in the beginning clause, the first category, partition whose section are less than 3 tefachim, wide, is not conceptually similar to the disqualification described in the end clause. The second category, partition whose sections are 3 tefachim or wider, psula dereisha, the disqualification described in the beginning clause, sections that are less than 3 tefachim wide, is based on the premise that the gaps in a partition must be narrow, so narrow that a goat cannot go through. A kid cannot leap through it in a single thrust. I mean, he can go through, but not so easily. Psula de seifa, whereas the disqualification described in the end clause, sections that are at least 3 tefachim wide, is based on the premise that the open area of the partition should not equal to the walled portion. The open should not equal to the solid. Now, a partition with solid sections that are exactly 3 tefachim wide is disqualified by gaps of 3 tefachim, because that's the opinion of Rav Huna, because in that event, its open area equal to its solid area. It therefore belongs in the second category because it shares the same disqualification of the second category. So we have 2 disqualification. Either it's the same opening, or a kid can easily go through it in a single thrust. First clause of the Baisa distinguishes between less than 3 tefachim and 3 tefachim. Money. Whose opinion does this reflect? Ema Rabbanoni. So it reflects the opinion of the rabbis, who says that Lovud applies to gaps that are less than 3 tefachim. Shloisha lo amrin on Lovud, but Lovud does not apply to gaps that are 3 tefachim or wider. Ema Seifa, Beside, however, the latter clause, the second category, whenever the solid sections of partitions are exactly 3 or between 3 and 4 tfachim wide, the second category includes wall sections up to, but not including 4 tfachim, and rules that when the partition as a whole is invalid, these individual sections are insignificant as well. This corresponds to the opinion of Rabbi Gamliel, who says that lavud applies to gaps that are less than 4 tfachim wide. Because if the Baisa were to be following the opinion of the rabbis, how could it designate a separate category of partition whose sections are between 3 and 4 tfachim wide, different than the third category of partition whose sections are exactly 4 tfachim wide or more? According to the rabbis, 3 tfachim and 4 tfachim are one and the same. There should be no difference between partitions whose sections are 3 tfachim wide and partitions with sections that are 4 tfachim wide. So how can the Tana of the Baisa follow the view of the rabbis in one clause and the dissenting view of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel in the next? Since the first clause follows the opinion of the rabbis, so the latter clause also follows the opinion of the rabbis. And the rabbis concede that as far as the permissibility of planting grain and greens opposite it, if there is a place of 4 tfachim wide, if the wall section is 4 tfachim wide, it is significant, and planting opposite it is permitted. And if not, the section is not at least 4 tfachim wide, it is not significant, and planting opposite it is prohibited. Rava Omar with the Sefer Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, we see that the end clause is the latter clause follows Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, Reisha Nami Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. So the first clause also would follow Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. V'chi Omar Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Amrin and Lovud. And when did Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says that we apply the Lovud, the rule of Lovud, or the principle of Lovud, even to gaps of up to 4 tfachim? That ruling applies only when the gaps are above, but when the gaps are below, it is like a partition through which kids can easily pass. We do not say lavud if the goats can easily pass through this gaps. Tashmad carrying in an enclosure formed by these walls that are mostly entrances and windows. Mostly entrances and windows is permitted, provided that the wall segments exceed the gaps. So the solid is more than the gaps. The Gemara asks the Baisa, do you think that the Baisa can actually mean that are mostly entrances and windows if the walls are mostly opening? Then the gaps exceed the wall segments. How could the Baisa then conclude, provided that the walled portion is larger than the open area? Rather, the Baisa must mean carrying within these walls, in which one made many entrances and windows is permitted, provided that the wall segment exceed the gaps. The opening are flanked by even wider wall segments. The Gemara infers from the Baisa only if the wall segments exceed the gaps is carrying prohibited. If they are equal, that was all the case all along, that we had a doubt. But if they equal the gaps, carrying is prohibited. This is a refutation of Rav Papa. The Gemara says, it is indeed a refutation, but the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Rav Papa. The Gemara says, how is it possible if he's challenged why the halacha is like him? There is a refutation of the opinion of Papa, and yet it is the accepted halacha. The Gemara says yes, because our Mishnah is precise according to Papa that none. We learned in the Mishnah the gaps should not exceed the solid parts. So binyan mutar, but if the gaps equal the solid parts, carrying is permitted, which is the opinion of Rav Papa. And with that, we'll start a new Mishnah. Makifin shloisha chavolin. The following Mishnah considers other ways that a caravan, a group of travelers reaching. It's getting late Friday afternoon, and they decide to do Shabbos in the middle of their traveling. So they would create an enclosure. So they're camping in an open field, can enclose their encampment to permit carrying on Shabbat. They surround their place of encampment with 3 horizontal ropes, one above the other and one above the other. So that's another option. We spoke about saddles. Now this Mishnah gives us the option of ropes. Provided that there is not between one rope and the next a gap of 3 tfachim. So the principle of law would apply to gaps narrower than 3 tfachim, and the entire partition is considered closed. The size of the ropes must be that their combined thickness amounts to more than a tefach, so that the total height of the partition includes the gaps, and the thickness of the 3 ropes is at least 10 tefachim. Makifim bekonim, and they may surround their place of encampment with a series of vertical poles, provided that provided that there is not between one pole and the next a gap of 3 tfachim. In this case, the principle of lavud applies, and the entire partition is considered closed. Although these partitions are valid, they are nevertheless inferior partitions. Inferior, why? Because they consist entirely of either vertical or horizontal components, and are physically more open than closed. The extent to which such inferior partitions may be relied upon is the subject of the following 4 Tanaic dispute. The rabbi spoke of a caravan when they permitted these partitions, where they did not permit their use for 1 or 2 individuals. They're dealing with a group of people. These are the words of Rabbi Menashe. They spoke of a caravan only because it is common case in which these inferior partitions are made. However, these partitions are valid even for an individual. So that's one machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis, whether this is only in a case of caravan or it's in a case of individual. The rabbi said it's also good for the individuals. Any partition that is not comprised of both vertical and horizontal, it's not considered a mechitza. It's not a proper partition. These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. One of the 2 is sufficient. Either vertical or horizontal will do the job. A partition only consists of either vertical or horizontal components. So this is starting the Gemara. They have said that if the wall segment exceeds the gaps in the case of partition comprised of vertical sections, it is considered a complete wall. By Rav Amnuna, so Rav Amnuna inquired, Ba'erev Mai, in what case, in the case of a partition comprised instead of horizontal components, what is the law? We spoke about vertical. What happens if it's horizontal? And is such a partition valid if a majority of its height is walled, but there are large horizontal gaps? Amar Abai Tashma, come learn. The size of the ropes must be such that their combined thickness amounts to more than a tefach. So that the total height of the partition, including the gaps and thickness of the ropes, is at least 10 tvachim. Now, if it is true that a partition of horizontal sections is valid, even if only a majority of its area is closed, why do I need the combined thickness of the ropes amount more than a tefach? Let him make the partition by leaving a space less than 3 tefachim and placing a rope of the slightest thickness over it, then leaving another space of less than 3 tefachim and placing a rope of the slightest thickness over that, and then leaving a space less than 4 tefachim and placing a rope of the slightest thickness over that too. The Gemara rejects the bias proof from its Yisbara. And do you think that a partition such as the one described by Abai could anyway be valid? Where could one put this gap of less than 4 tefachim? If he puts it on the bottom next to the ground, with the other 2 gaps of less than 3 tefachim above it, it would be like a partition through which kids, referring to goats, can easily pass. Small animals could go through the gaps of 3 tefachim that exist along the bottom of the partitions, and therefore the partition is invalid. And if he were to put it, the gap of almost 4 tefachim on top, with the other 2 gaps beneath it, the partition would be invalid because the open space on this side of the uppermost rope and the open space on the other side of it come and nullify it. A solid segment of a wall is regarded as non-existent if it is flanked on both sides by gaps of at least 3 tefachim, each of them wider than the solid segment. If he were to put it, the gap of almost 4 tefachim in the middle, with one of the gaps less than 3 tefachim beneath it and other above it, it would be a case in which the wall section exceeds the gap between them only when the wall sections on both sides of the gap are combined. The gap is flanked by closed sections which individually are narrower than the gap, and only their combined width exceeds that of the gap. Shmat mina. Learn from this. Oimed merube ala porutz mishte ruches ave oimed. You would learn from it that wall segments that exceeds the gap in between only when the sections on both sides of the gap are combined is nevertheless a valid wall. But since the law is that wall segments individually smaller than the gap in between do not combine to form a valid wall, the Mishnah could not have given such a case. Ela Rav Amnuna, Achi komi baile. This is what Rav Amnuna was asking. For example, one took a mat, Marcellus took a mat that is slightly more than 7 tefachim high, v'chokak bo gimel, and cut out of the 7 tefachim, and cut out of it a strip 3 tefachim high. V'chokak bo gimel, v'shovak bo daled umashu, and left in the mat a strip of 4 tefachim high on one side of the gap, and a strip of the slightest width on the other side of the gap. You can see it in diagram 27. And he then positioned it less than 3 tefachim from the ground. Avuna questions whether such a partition is invalid because of the gap, or whether it is valid because most of it is closed. Kedevor mini Rabbi Tavlo mirav. Rav Amnuna inquired concerning a suspended partition, a full partition of 10 tefachim that is suspended 3 tefachim or more above the ground. Does the greater solid partition above serve to nullify the smaller gap below? Can a suspended partition that is suspended in the air, permit carrying in a churva, in a ruin? Is carrying permitted in a dilapidated building whose walls are breached at the ground level? A suspended partition permits only in the water. Remember, you can look at the diagram 30, see the picture over there. Guy from the window, through the window, reaches a small box. Through it, he gets to the water. Suspended partition permits only carrying in regard to water. There's special leniency that the sages allowed in regard to water, to allow people to draw water from the area bounded by the suspended partition. Next part, makivim bekonim, they may surround with poles, not vertical poles. The Rabbi spoke only of a caravan when they permitted these inferior partition. These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. Only with a caravan. What about individual? Individual, no. Rabbis did not permit any Shabbos partitions for an individual if they enclose an area of more than 2 Beis Seyas. This statement of Rabbi Yehuda implies that if they enclose an area of 2 Beis Seyah or less, they are valid even for individual. Unlike his statement in the Mishnah, which implies that they are not valid at all for individual. As Rav Nachman answered elsewhere, and some say it was rather of Bivi bar Abai. It refers only to allowing them enough space for all their needs. When the Tana invalidates an inferior partition, he did not invalidate it completely, but only for the purpose of enclosing an area larger than 2 Beis Seyas, even though the people need the larger area to fully accommodate their needs. Achanami litinan kol tzorkon, here too, Rabbi Yehuda's statement in the Mishnah refers only to the issue of allowing them enough space for all their needs. The issue discussed in the Mishnah concerns using an inferior partition to accommodate needs in excess of 2 Beis Seyah. Rabbi Yehuda rules that it is valid for a caravan. Individuals, however, may not use an inferior partition to enclose an area larger than 2 Beis Seyah, but individuals may use it to enclose 2 Beis Seyah or less, exactly as stated in the Baisa. Heicha itmar de Rav Nachman ve'itima Rav Bibi bar Abai. Where, in response to which question was this answer of Rav Nachman, and some say it was Rav Bibi bar Abai. Any partition that is not vertical and horizontal, it's not a valid partition. These are the words of Rabbi Yosef. Is it really what Rabbi Yosef said? V'atanya, we learned in a Baisa, it was taught in a Baisa, echad yochid ve'echad shayor l'chavolim, both an individual and a caravan are included in the permit to carry within an area enclosed by partition of ropes. What then is the difference between an individual and a caravan? We allow individual 2 Beis Seyah. If only one person uses the area enclosed by inferior walls, it must not exceed 2 Beis Seyah. We allow 2 individuals as well, only 2 Beis Seyah. Gimel nasu shayor or v'noisin beis sheish diva beis Yehuda. The 3 people constitute a caravan, and we allow them to use these partitions to enclose an area of up to 6 Beis Seyah. These are the words of Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Yehuda. But the sages say, Echad yochid ve'echad she'er neslim kol tzorkan. We allow both an individual and a caravan to use inferior partitions to enclose an area as wide as necessary for all their needs, provided that there is no area of 2 beiseas vacant in the enclosure. The area enclosed by the inferior partition must not exceed what its occupants require by 2 beisea or more. In this Baiser, Rabbi Yossi, the son of Yehuda, permits the use of inferior walls, albeit to a limit extent. This contradicts his ruling in the Mishnah that inferior walls are invalid. The statement of Rabbi Yossi, the son of Yehuda, in the Mishnah refers only to the issue of allowing them enough space for all their needs. I.e., Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, forbade the use of inferior walls for the purpose of enclosing an area larger than the limits he sets in the Baisa, even though the people need a larger area to fully accommodate their needs. But he agrees that carrying is permitted within the inferior walls, if the area that they enclose is not larger than the limits he sets in the Baisa. Dorash Rav Nachman Mishum Rabbeinu Shmuel. Rav Nachman expounded in the name of Rabbeinu Shmuel the area enclosed by inferior partition. The area enclosed by inferior partitions of only horizontal or vertical components may be no larger than the following. We allow an individual 2 beisea. We allow 2 people 2 beisea. 3 people constitute a caravan, and we allow them 6 beisea. He rules in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Yehuda. Have you forsaken the opinion of the rabbis and acted in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Yehuda? The opinion of the majority sages should take precedence over that of the individual. The individual Tana, which is Rabbi Yossi, the son of Yehuda. Rav Nachman then appointed a speaker on this matter and expounded. The statement that I previously made to you, that we follow the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, the son of Yehuda, was an error on my part. In truth, the following is what they said. We allow an individual 2 beisea. We allow 2 people 2 beisea. 3 people constitute a caravan. When the moment it's 3 people, it's already considered a caravan. And noisin laim kol tzorkon. We allow them enough space for all their needs, no matter how large an area this may be. Rav Nachman revised the latter part of his ruling, the part that concerned a caravan, to conform with the opinion of the rabbis, the opinion of the majority. We allow as much space as the caravan's members require. We'll continue, God willing, tomorrow. Wuchem to you.